All right, so this Knife Thoughts video is going to be an overview of these knives and really a first look, because what these are is the Ohio River Jack prototypes from traditionalpocketknives.com, C. Reisner Cutlery. So first of all, I wanted to say a huge thank you to Austin for sending these along for me to check out. I obviously love getting to check out knives in general, but especially new knives that are coming out. So I really enjoyed getting to see these. And I'm looking forward to seeing them come to fruition. So as always, make sure you check out my other social media. I'm on Instagram and Facebook at Knife Thoughts, my website knifethoughts.com, and make sure you subscribe to the channel here, click the bell and select all. But what are these? So these are a new modern slip joint from, again, traditionalpocketknives.com, C. Reisner Cutlery, and they'll only be available there. So this isn't like, a lot of knives that are designed and then made by an OEM and then are sold by a bunch of different dealers. These are exclusive to traditionalpocketknives.com. So it makes it a little bit simpler to get them, and also means that, you only have to look at one place for information, pricing, things like that. But I don't have exact numbers on all that kind of stuff because, again, these are prototypes. So Austin sent these along just for me to check them out, and I knew about this upcoming model for a while. He just let me know that he was working on it, and so I was excited to, actually get them in hand. So what is this? Well, a modern slip joint is a knife that has modern materials and construction, in the sense that these have titanium bolsters and liners. They have micarta or titanium covers, and they are screwed construction rather than pin construction. But they have a slip joint mechanism, so it does not lock. There's a spring that holds the knife closed and open. And they also have a traditional aesthetic. Now, some modern slip joints don't have a traditional aesthetic, but I would say that these definitely fall into that category. So it's a category of knives that I think has become quite popular recently. If you follow my channel, you probably saw the review that I did of this knife, the Jack Wolf Knives Sharpshooter Jack, another new brand actually with their first model coming out. And I'll show you some comparisons between that and the Ohio River Jacks in a bit. But it's definitely something where more people are being introduced to slip joints through these modern slip joints. And I think that's a good thing. I think it helps keep these traditional patterns alive. So I like that about these. And then the modern construction also makes them a little bit more maintainable. Now, I'm not someone who is big on taking apart and modifying and all that kind of stuff, but it definitely allows you to do that more easily than on a knife that is pinned, because it just, you have to actually break the knife apart basically versus unscrewing it. The other thing about being a modern slip joint is that it can have some nice features. So one of those features that I do like is washers. Now, it might be hard to see in there, but there are phosphor bronze washers on each side of each blade. So that makes it nice and smooth. It gives you a really consistent feel as you're opening and closing the knife. Another thing that modern slip joints can have, but not all have, is a stop pin. So if you look inside right there above my finger, that is a pin that makes it so when the blade closes, instead of the kick, this little spot here, and I'll give you an example on a traditional knife. There's the kick. And then also on a modern slip joint that does not have a stop pin, again, the Sharpshooter Jack, instead of the kick stopping the blade from continuing to close and then having the edge hit the spring, there's a pin that makes it pretty much impossible for there to be blade wrap. Now, I actually have had some, I would say, less expensive, less high quality knives that did have stop pins that still had blade wrap, but it makes it a lot less likely and allows you to get a little bit more blade into the blade well without worrying about blade wrap. So that's another nice feature. Now, one thing that Austin told me is that these knives with the micarta don't necessarily have the micarta covers that came with that specific knife. So the reason for that is because these are prototypes, and he ordered a bunch of different handle cover materials, so the scales, and he ended up sending out these prototypes to me, and Advanced Knife Pro got to check them out, probably some other people. But he sent these out with the handles that they will end up coming with. So they aren't necessarily fit to this particular knife. But it also means that it will be a little bit easier to get custom scales if you'd like to do that type of thing. Get some other type of handle material made for your knife. So again, for people who do like to do that type of thing, modding and customizing, that's a nice little feature. And then the other thing is that being a modern construction knife, it allows for some really nice and consistent machining. So a great example on these knives is if you look inside the pivot, you can see that there's beveling on the insides of these liners and bolsters. And the nice thing about that is that it makes it so that it's a little bit less hard of an edge. Now, maybe sometimes people consider that to be less fine finishing. And I think that there's an argument for that. But on the other hand, it makes it so that, you have really consistent feel, a nice feel, so that it's not catching and sharp on your finger and things like that. So I think that that's something that overall I consider to be a positive. But like I say, it's different than a traditional slip joint, traditional construction slip joint, and some people might not prefer that, but I do think that it's nice on these. And then you get some machining that allows for these edges to be rounded. You get really nice threading because, again, those are, machined with programming, so that it's not as much variability of a hand machined knife, or certainly a punched out or stamped knife. So I do like that. And that's true also for the blades. When you have a blade that is, machined with programming, you're going to have really consistent edges, really consistent primary grinds across the blades, and it allows for a nice thin grind. I haven't used these a whole lot, I'll be honest, because they are prototypes. I didn't want to, mess them up, but it seems like they'll cut really well, and these long pulls are really well machined. They're nice and rounded, but you can catch them with your nail really easily also. So I think that there's a lot of good that can be had in the modern construction. But I do appreciate that they have a traditional styling to them. So this is what I would call an equal end pattern. You might call it a coffin pattern, because rather than having a rounded edge at the bolsters, it has this beveled, squared off look. So equal end coffin. Now, I'm sure there's someone who will have a better name for this. I'd love to hear it in the comments if you know a more specific name for this type of pattern, but it's certainly an equal end. Now, the bolster is larger on the pivot end than on the butt end, but it does also have this squared coffin type ends. So definitely has some traditionalness to the pattern itself. And real quick, I wanted to give you an example of a knife that's very similar in the pattern, not exactly the same, but very similar, which is this knife that recently was made by Gradation Cutlery. This is the number 36 toenail clipper, and there's a lot of similarity. Now, the toenail clipper is certainly a little bit bigger, and it does have rounded ends, but it's another equal end knife. Now, in this case, you call this an elephant toenail. Sometimes a sunfish, but I think technically a sunfish is not an equal end, whereas this elephant toenail is an equal end. You might call this an elephant toenail, but I do think it's a little bit more of an equal end jack, in my opinion. But you can see some similarities, and if I open the blade on both these knives, you can see even more similarity when it comes to the blade shape. So I just do appreciate that kind of homage to traditionality in the pattern itself. And another thing where you can see that is in the jigging on this particular version. Now, this particular version is in full titanium. So there are not covers or scales. It's just titanium with jigging between the two bolster areas. And I think this looks really great. In fact, this is the one that I'm hoping to get. I really like this jigging a lot. I think it's really well done. And I think that it does really look similar to traditional jigging, and it looks on par with some of the titanium jigging on knives that are in a little bit higher price range than I think this knife is going to come out at, that are also, you know, modern traditionals made in China. And that is where these are made. These are made in China, and I know a lot of people who like traditional knives are, you know, have strong feelings about that, and that's fine. I think that there's a lot of valid thoughts in that. But unfortunately, it seems from talking with people who have knives like this made that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find someone who would make knives like this in America, let alone to do so at a reasonable price range. So I haven't tried myself, but that's what it seems like from different people who have this type of knife made. And if you watch my channel, you know I am certainly open to knives made overseas, knives made in China, and I think that they're making really good knives. Now, who is actually making this knife? The nice thing is that Austin can actually say who the OEM is. The OEM, the original manufacturer of this knife, is QSP. And QSP is a brand that, or really a brand of a manufacturer that makes a lot of knives like this. A lot of these smaller brands that where the person designs the knife but doesn't actually make them are made by QSP, and they do a good job. And I think that's the case here. Everything, as I mentioned earlier, seems to be really well machined and just well done in general. So I think QSP is a good option for these, especially because, again, they do have so much experience. They're so widespread in the knife market. Speaking of QSP being made overseas, the price on these, I made a post on Reddit and made a mistake. I was off by $100. These seem like they're going to be coming out in the around $200 range, some below and maybe some above, but I think more so below, around $175. Of course, it'll depend on the cover materials and whether it's a two blade or a single blade. So speaking of that, I want to show you these two blades and give you some thoughts on the blades. So this is the two-bladed version. You can see it's pretty thick. The stock for these blades is relatively thick. I'll show you a comparison to a 3-layer Swiss Army knife in A-locks. And you can see that the Ohio River Jack is a little thicker. So, you know, it's maybe not as compact, not as efficient with the space as a Swiss Army knife, but very few things are, and that's not really what this knife is about, I don't think. But there is this two-bladed version, and the two-blade options are, sorry for the shakiness, the two-blade options are a spear point, pretty classic spear point too, really kind of a bulbous, almost towards a balloon type spear point, but not quite. Really just a classic spear point, some straight edge, a nice curved belly, and then a tip. Then the second option is a sheepfoot, and I think this is a really nice sheepfoot. It has, you know, a curve. There is a little bit of curve to the blade, which is not 100% traditional, but most sheepfoot knives, once you carry and use them and sharpen them, tend to have a curve in them anyway. But the secondary blade is this pretty classic sheepfoot. You can see on this two-bladed version, the long pull on the sheepfoot is on the secondary side, and it is actually a little bit different than the single blade sheepfoot. So you can see it's a little bit closer towards a Wharncliffe. Now, I wouldn't call this a Wharncliffe. I would probably still call this a sheepfoot. But it's definitely moving towards a Wharncliffe from a sheepfoot. This is much more like a traditional sheepfoot, but you can see that there's a difference in that this sheepfoot single blade has a saber grind, whereas the double blade has a full grind. So just a little bit of a difference, and the long pull is on the show side, the front side, on the single blade version. I actually really like both of these sheepfoots. I don't really think that it's going to make a big difference in use which shape. I think they'll both work pretty much exactly the same. The grind might be a little bit thicker on this one just because it's a little less tall, so it might not move through cardboard quite as well, but I think that, you know, it's probably not really a practical issue. So there are two options of blade shapes across the single blades, but really there are actually three blade shapes that are being used. A little bit of a different sheet foot on the two blade than on the single blade. So that's an interesting little thing just to be aware of. If you look at the single blade sheet foot and then decide to get the two blade, it won't be the exact same sheet foot. But the spear point on the single blade and the spear point on the two blade seem to be pretty much the same. I don't really see any difference between those two. So just an interesting little thing. And one other thing I wanted to mention about the spear point, this is really a preference thing, a personal preference thing. I actually did talk to Austin about this, and he said it was intentional. But one thing that I noticed about this spear point is that the spine actually seems to be canted upwards from the back spring slightly. Now, there are certainly traditional knives that are made like that, and then there are certainly traditional knives that have a more straight spine and spring, and then there are some that are canted forward slightly. So it's something where it's not out of the realm of traditionality. I personally don't really prefer an upward canted blade, so I do tend to like the sheet foot version, certainly of the single blade, better than the single blade spear point. But again, I think that's a personal preference thing. You'll just have to decide yourself whether you care about that or like it or don't like it. It's not a practical thing, I don't think, when you're using this knife. It's not really going to matter too much whether it's slightly canted upwards or not. But just something I noticed from a design standpoint. Now, moving on to the action, you've already seen it a little bit, but it has really nice action. Nice walk and talk. The walk and talk is a little bit different than a knife that doesn't have a stop. Actually, I think this does have a stop pin. Yeah, this does have a stop pin. That's a bad example. The walk and talk is a little bit different than a knife that doesn't have a stop pin. It's a little bit more muted, more of a thud than a twing. I don't know if that makes sense, but it does sound a little bit different than a knife without a stop pin, but it has nice spring both to open, to half stop and closed, and vice versa. I would say that the pulls on this are pretty much right about a 5, so a nice pull where it certainly isn't going to close too easily, but you know, you can open it easily enough. And the pulls are pretty similar across all of them, if not exactly the same. Listen to the action on this one. I really like it. That's nice, huh? Anyway, I really like this one. I was actually had this one in a traditional pocket knives slip here today. Fits really well. It's actually quite a bit shorter than the slip, but this is a really big slip. Good for making sure that I keep it safe and don't lose it. But these are nice slips also. Just a little thought. I had this one in my pocket in that slip today. And then moving on to the two blade, same deal. Pretty much the same, about a 5. Really nice action and easy to open and close with the long pulls, and the sheep foot is pinchable, whereas for me at least the spear point, it's pinchable, but it's kind of tough. You kind of roll your fingers up under and you can pinch it. It's a little easier to use the long pull on the spear point, whereas on the sheep foot I definitely tend to use a pinch open method. Now, I want to talk about some comparisons. Here is, again, a Lion Steel Dom. This is a Collector Knives exclusive. I really like this knife. It's definitely different. So this is made in Italy, whereas these are made in China. The price range, these actually are a little bit less. I believe this is about 150 in the carbon fiber. I might be misremembering. But differences in finishing. You can see that the back spring and the spine are rounded on this, and that just makes it a little bit easier to fit the knife together. And the back spring is a little bit low on the Lion Steel. Now everything else is pretty nice on it, but definitely some differences there. And then on this, the back springs are pretty much flush in all the positions, and there's really, you know, it's nicely finished. And then I did talk about that in the Jack Wolf knives. I think the Jack Wolf knives are just a little bit more finely finished, with, you know, having everything really flush and not using that kind of beveling that I talked about earlier. So you can think about this being somewhere between the Lion Steel knives and a Jack Wolf knife. So just to give you an idea. Now I wanted to give some size comparisons. I already showed the thickness of this compared to a Swiss Army knife, but here is the Ohio River Jack with a gradation cutlery number 15. You can see the 15 is both shorter and less tall. And here is a Case Sodbuster Jr. Let's see, should I move this a little bit? The Sodbuster Jr. is similar in length overall. It's a little bit thicker, but it has a shorter blade, so you do get more edge out of the knife on the Ohio River Jack. But the Ohio River Jack is definitely not a huge knife. It's not a small knife. I would call it medium to large, but it's not a huge knife by any means. And again, I'm not a huge slip person, but I did carry it in this slip just for safety, and I found it to, you know, carry perfectly fine. So I really have enjoyed getting to check these knives out. I think that they're really interesting. I think it's a good thing that someone who really does love and care about traditional knives like Austin is bringing out a, you know, modern traditional or a modern slip joint. And I think that it's good for the market. So I hope people enjoy these. I'm interested to see the production knives. These again are prototypes. I'm interested to see if there are any differences with the production. One thing I forgot to mention real quick, the blades are M390, so a good steel. Like I say, I have really enjoyed getting to check them out. I don't know exactly when these are going to be released. I know that there is information that comes on them in packages from Traditional Pocket Knives, as well as on their site, so you can definitely check that out, and I will link to it in the description. But definitely keep your eye out on these, and follow Traditional Pocket Knives on social media. They do a lot of updates on there. And as always, make sure you check out my other social media. I am on Instagram and Facebook at Knife Thoughts. You can use my hashtag ThinkKnifeThoughts if you want to. You don't have to, but you can if you want to. Also, check out my blog, knifethoughts.com, where I post articles on knives like this and knife-related topics. And of course, last but not least, as always, don't forget to go out and do good.